Hey everybody, it's Ron, and I want to tell you a story about business and how that story changed everything. In 2019, reporters at the Washington Post published a story that surprised a lot of people. The article described a massive investment fund connected to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. According to documents from a former insider who had filed a complaint with the Internal Revenue Service, the church's investment arm, named Ensign Peak Advisors, had quietly built a portfolio worth $100 billion. The fund held stocks, bonds, farmland, commercial real estate, and other long-term investments. And that reporting quickly spread. The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times television networks, podcasts, and talk radio all picked up the story asking the same question in slightly different ways. How does a religious institution accumulate that much capital? And maybe the more interesting question, how does it maintain a financial structure that large across generations? And the thing to understand, most major religious institutions in the world had centuries to develop their systems of governance. The Catholic Church evolved through councils and reforms stretching back nearly 2,000 years. Protestant churches split and reorganized repeatedly across Europe and North America. Institutional structure usually develops slowly. But the organization behind those financial headlines took shape much faster. Its governance and leadership structure were built in a relatively short window on the American frontier, long before the investment portfolios, long before global membership. Someone had to decide how the institution itself would work, how it would be governed, how authority would flow, and how a small religious movement could hold together as it grew. Those decisions begin with a small group of people gathering in a farmhouse in Fayette, New York, because that's where a new church was formally organized on April 6, 1830. Long before the investment funds and global membership, the movement began with a much smaller project: printing a book. In 1829, a man by the name of Joseph Smith and his followers were trying to publish what Smith said was a translation of ancient scripture. It was called the Book of Mormon. And it's important to remember that printing a book in the early 19th century was expensive. The local printer in Palmyra, New York, a man named E.B. Grandin, initially refused the job. The manuscript was controversial, and the print run Smith wanted was large, roughly 5,000 copies. Eventually, Grandin agreed, but only after one of Smith's early supporters, Martin Harris, mortgaged part of his farm to guarantee payment. So the book was printed in 1830. As copies circulated through western New York and nearby states, a small group of followers began to form around Smith's teachings. And that created a new problem. Movements built around ideas can gather followers pretty quickly, but if they're going to last, they need structure. Questions like who leads, who has authority, how are decisions made? Joseph Smith addressed those questions in a meeting held in a farmhouse belonging to Peter Whitmer Sr. in Fayette, New York. On April 6, 1830, Smith and a small group of followers formally organized what they called the Church of Christ, the institution that would later become known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Early church records describe the meeting as small, roughly 6 official members at the moment of the organization. But what happened in that room mattered, because the movement was no longer just a message or a book, it had become an institution.
Telling my girls about my Alzheimer's diagnosis was hard.
But Mom's early detection gave us time to make a plan.
Talk to your family about seeing a doctor. Go to alz.org/time to talk. A message from the Alzheimer's Association and the Ad Council.
As the church grew during the early 1830s, its members moved repeatedly across the American frontier. First to Kirtland, Ohio, then to Missouri, where church leaders believed they had been directed to gather their followers. But the movement's rapid growth created tension almost immediately. New members often arrived in large groups, buying land and settling near one another. They tended to vote together in local elections and trade within their own community. To early settlers, that kind of cohesion could feel less like a new church and more like a political and economic bloc suddenly appearing in town. At the same time, the movement's claims were controversial. Missionaries preached that new scripture had been revealed and that Joseph Smith spoke with prophetic authority. That message attracted converts, but it also angered existing churches and local leaders, so suspicion spread pretty quickly. Conflicts between Mormon settlers and early residents in Missouri escalated through the 1830s, eventually erupting into violence. By 1838, the crisis had grown severe enough that Missouri's governor issued what became known as the Extermination Order, forcing members of the church to leave the state. The movement relocated again, this time to Nauvoo, Illinois, where the church built a rapidly growing city along the Mississippi River during the early 1840s. By then, the institution Joseph Smith had organized was no longer a small religious group. It had a leadership hierarchy, missionary programs, and thousands of followers spread across several states. But in June 1844, the movement faced a crisis that could easily have destroyed it. Joseph Smith was arrested and jailed in Carthage, Illinois, along with his brother Hiram Smith. On June 27, 1844, a mob stormed the jail and both of those men were killed. In many organizations built around a charismatic founder, that moment would have ended the story. Instead, the movement faced a new question. Who leads now? Several individuals claimed authority, but the largest group of followers ultimately rallied behind Brigham Young, a senior church leader and president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Young's leadership would reshape the institution in ways that influence it all the way through to today. Because instead of dissolving after Smith's death, the organization continued to grow, and soon it would make one of the most dramatic relocations in American history.
When I smoke weed, I get lost in the music. I like to isolate each instrument. The rhythmic bass, the harmonies on the piano, the sticky melody.
Hey, careful, babe. There's someone crossing the street.
Sorry, I didn't see him there.
If you feel different, you drive different. Don't drive high. It's dangerous and illegal everywhere. A message from NHTSA and the Ad Council.
Hear that? That's the sound of your life. Perfectly imperfect. Beating in rhythm to the world you've created. But every time you drive after drinking, the music gets drowned out. Your life sounds pretty great. Don't let a buzz ruin it. Buzz driving is drunk driving. Don't drive buzzed. A message from NHTSA and the Ad Council.
After Joseph Smith's death in 1844, tensions surrounding the church didn't disappear. In Nauvoo, Illinois, hostility toward the rapidly growing Mormon community continued to rise. Political conflicts or economic competition and lingering resentment from earlier disputes kept relations with surrounding communities pretty strained. By 1845, the situation had reached a breaking point. The Illinois state legislature revoked Nauvoo's city charter, stripping the city of its legal authority. Violence and threats followed, and church leaders began to conclude that remaining in Illinois was no longer sustainable. Brigham Young and the church leadership began planning a radical solution. If the movement could not live peacefully inside the existing American communities, then they'd have to leave them behind. Young proposed leading the church west, beyond the settled frontier of the United States. At that time, the destination he chose wasn't even an American territory. The Salt Lake Valley, described in expedition reports by explorer John C. Fremont, lay deep in the Rocky Mountains in what was then northern Mexico. The region was remote, dry, and far from established population centers, which, from Young's perspective, made it ideal. Beginning in 1846, thousands of church members began leaving the Midwest in organized wagon companies, crossing the plains toward the Rocky Mountains. The first group entered the Salt Lake Valley in July of 1847. What they built there was more than a statement. It was a society organized around the church's existing institutional structure. New towns and areas were laid out in careful grids. Irrigation canals were constructed collectively to turn desert land into farmland. Church leadership often directed where new settlements would be established across the region. And economic systems developed alongside the community. Members contributed what's called tithing, which is typically a tenth of income or production, which supported church operations, welfare programs, and the construction of temples and meeting houses and other shared resources. Over time, those systems created a centralized institution capable of managing land and resources and finances across a growing membership. Missionary work spread the church far beyond the American West, bringing converts from Europe, the Pacific, and eventually across the globe. And nearly 2 centuries later, the institutional structure that began on the American frontier still exists. It's the same structure behind the reporting that caught national attention in 2019 when the Washington Post, followed by the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, reported on a whistleblower complaint with the IRS. That complaint described a massive investment portfolio managed by the church's investment arm. But the real story behind all of that wasn't simply the size of the assets. It was the institutional structure that allowed a small religious movement to survive persecution, migration, and the loss of its founder, and still operates today as a centralized organization nearly 200 years later. That was a structure that began when Joseph Smith formally organized the church on April 6, 1830. I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the podcast that finds the turning points behind the headlines. To hear more stories like this, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the stories, please leave a quick review and a rating. It helps more people find the story behind the business. And if you want to understand business better without the lectures or the buzzwords or the MBA language, start by visiting us at businessdailypodcast.com.